Thor is the fourth MCU film following Iron Man 2. It stars Chris Hemsworth as Thor, Tom Hiddleston as Loki, and Natalie Portman as Jane Foster. Thor showed up in a bunch of Marvel cartoons before this film, but was only featured in live action once before the film, which was a TV film, The Incredible Hulk Returns. This version of the character is pretty different from the MCU and comic books versions, being very Norse-based and dressing like a Viking. It's a little weird, but it's kind of a fun TV movie and a decent enough first appearance of Thor in live action. The plot of Thor goes as follows. After a break-in from a handful of frost giants, Thor loses his hammer and powers and is deemed unworthy, and then is sent to Earth. There he meets Jane Foster and her fellow scientists. Thor finds his hammer in a shield outpost, but learns he's unworthy. Over time, he eventually learns he is worthy again and regains his hammer. He also learns that his brother Loki conspired to make himself the king of Asgard, their home planet. After a fight, Loki is seemingly killed and Thor is trapped on Asgard. Thor was originally envisioned by Sam Raimi before he made Spider-Man, before being passed to David Goyer, and then Thor, like Iron Man, would sit in development hell until Marvel Studios and the MCU became a thing. When the film began production, they were eyeballing Guillermo del Toro, but he turned it down so that he could work on The Hobbit, which he'd also famously exit later on in its production. Daniel Craig was offered the role of Thor, but had to turn it down due to commitments with another franchise he helmed, James Bond. Ultimately, they went with Chris Hemsworth, who holds the role of Thor to this day and continues to appear in movies ever since. The main character of this film is Thor. Unlike the comics, he isn't ever Donald Blake, Thor's normal human identity, rather just being Thor throughout the film. That said, Donald Blake is referenced when Thor is arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. midway through the film. Thor is deemed not worthy of his hammer in the film, but later regains the power after he learns some humanity and tries to defend the town he is in when the destroyers attack the town. Loki learns he's a frost giant, which ruins his relationship with his father. Ultimately, he sabotages his family and tries to start a war between Asgard and Jotunheim, the home of the frost giants. Much like the comics, he's a god of mischief and uses his powers to fight his brother and sabotage his family. Like in the comics, he's born from the frost giants. In the film, Jane is a scientist, but in the comics, she's a nurse. In both, she's a bit of a generic love interest, but at least in the film, she's fairly proactive, if a bit bland. And Natalie Portman puts in a decent enough performance as Jane. Odin is the king of Asgard, who years ago defended the Earth from an invasion by frost giants. Now he's an older king looking to pass the throne on to Thor. In the comics, Odin is pretty similar, basically just being the ruler of Asgard. Sif makes her first appearance, being a close friend and ally to Thor. This is pretty much what she is in the comics too, not much has really changed here with Sif. Hawkeye makes a cameo appearance as another tie-in to the upcoming Avengers film. His role is a definite cameo, so I'll touch on him more when he's further fleshed out in the Avengers itself, but needless to say, it's just one of those MCU cameo moments. The Destroyer is a prominent threat in the film, attacking a small town that Thor is residing in. In the comics, the Destroyer is a villain to Thor that is meant to defend Earth from threats with its power, which rivals the gods. Thor is forced to fight it to defend himself after Loki sends it after him. This is pretty much the same plot as the Destroyer's original comics. Mjolnir is Thor's powerful hammer that can summon lightning and can only be held by those who are worthy. In this film, many people try to excavate it, but only Thor is able to wield the hammer in the film. In the end credits scene, Nick Fury asks Selvig, one of Jane Foster's scientist friends, to investigate the Tesseract. However, Selvig is being influenced by Loki. This is further set up for the upcoming Avengers film. Stan Lee has a cameo, like in all these films, where he tries to pull Thor's hammer out of the ground, but he fails and loses his back bumper. My thoughts on this film: I liked it more than the last couple times I watched it, but honestly, it's just a bit boring. There's some cool moments, and Asgard is well designed, but the costumes are a little bit bland, and some of the makeup, like Thor's dyed eyebrows, is a little jarring. It also has the problem where Thor loses his powers for a lot of the film, which is a bit of a boring plot twist. Set-piece wise, things like the initial Frost Giant battle were cool, and the final battle on the Frost Bridge were also pretty cool. Visually, this film actually has a lot going for it when it's doing visually cool things. Things like the town were shot kind of boring, and were a pretty lame diversion from what we were seeing on Asgard. And Loki was a fun villain, if not fully established to the level of later films, but Tom Hiddleston is pretty fun. And you can definitely see some potential in Chris Hemsworth, though he's a bit bland in this film. As for the score, it's a bit generic, but it works. It's nothing you'll really maintain outside of watching the film, and is pretty passable, I guess, much like all these MCU films, but nothing that's crazy good like we would see with a few films later on. In terms of a reading list, I'd suggest Mighty Marvel Masterworks #1, which covers Journey into Mystery 83 through 100. It's a pretty solid introduction to Marvel's Thor, and it'll get the job done. I also read Journey into Mystery 118 for this so that I could learn more about the Destroyer. Thor is going to be our first film we cover that has a one-shot or a short film accompanied with it. The Consultant is a short film that basically explains why Tony Stark was in the end credits of The Incredible Hulk. It's okay, and it makes some sense of why Nick Fury wasn't in the end of The Incredible Hulk, but it feels like a bit of a backstep to kind of explain things that happened in Iron Man 2 than a strong short film in and of itself. In conclusion, Thor is a watchable film with further ties to the upcoming Avengers film, but I find it as a film in its own right to be pretty skippable, as it's kind of boring aside from a few cool set pieces. Asgard's really cool, as well as Jotunheim, the home of the Frost Giants, but even some cool imagery can't save the film from being a bit dull. Ultimately, the film is another step towards creating Marvel's expansive universe and proves that not all films need to be grounded on Earth. But yeah, it's pretty skippable. If you're just looking for the highlights of the MCU, I would say pass on this one. In the next video, we'll be looking at the first entry of our third flagship franchise in the Infinity Saga, this time with Captain America the First Avenger. And also, this video will be pretty fun because I get to look at a bunch of other Captain America movies for it. So stay tuned for that, coming in the next couple weeks.